Dear friends and colleagues, I welcome you all on behalf of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, ASHA, and Ganga Jamni Heritage. Our speaker of the day is Professor Syed Jabir Raza, who has been with us before too. He is not only a founder member of our organization, ASHA, but a scholar of early medieval Indian history. He has worked on the Ghaznavites in India. He, having worked on Punjab and Sindh under the Ghaznavides, he took up extensive work on life and conditions of Punjab of the same period. He has written extensively on various aspects pertaining to this period, including a very well researched paper on the concept of Fiqh. He has been a Charles Wallace Fellow. In fact, he was the first from Aligarh to have gone to SOAS as a Charles Wallace Fellow. He was also a visiting fellow at Paris in 1996. He has also been associated with a project of ICHR, which was on Dictionary of Social, Economic, and Administrative Terms in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu inscriptions, which is being edited by Professor Irfan Habib. The first time Professor Raza spoke was on Ghaznavide historical sources. Today, he will talk about the epigraphs as a source for understanding our past. He would tell us which inscriptions survive and what do they tell us about the period in which they were prepared. He would perhaps also tell us how to use such sources to reconstruct knowledge about the medieval period in India. Welcome, Professor Jabir Raza. Professor Jabir Raza, before all of you.
Thank you, Nadeem, for these kind words. Actually, at the very outset, I would like to clarify that although my topic demands the survey of the epigraphs of the full medieval period up till Mughal period, but on account of large numbers of these epigraphs, I cut it short to Sultanate period. And I'm sure it will convey the importance of the epigraphs for the reconstruction of the medieval history. So, of all the data, epigraphs belongs to the archaeological genre. So, of all the data provided by archaeology, inscriptions on metal or coins, stones, and other hard surfaces have been considered as most trustworthy and precise evidence to reconstruct the history of the past. Historians working on the Sultanate period usually focus rather exclusively on the extant sources. This is rather unfortunate because the inscriptions are equally significant sources for the history of that period and provide evidence and details about the developments that are not found in the written sources. Because these inscriptions mainly deals with the provincial side of the history, and which this provincial side of the history generally overlooked by the contemporary main sources written in Delhi or written in the court attached, the writer attached with the courts. So the point to emphasize here is that the inscriptions are public documents and are forms of communication. They were written in a wide range of languages, and it was not unusual for an inscription to bear traces of multiple linguistic registers. Actually, we find a three language more frequently used for these inscriptions: Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. But the local dialects also played a role. In Gujarat, the local dialects; in Maharashtra, the local dialects; in Rajasthan, the local dialects. So some way, although in Sultanate period we find less involvement of the local dialects, but in Mughal period it was more. So this is something that has been found to be the case with the inscriptions in Gujarat that have been studied by Samira Sheikh. The linguistic multilingualism in inscription is actually a reflection of multiculturalism of the period. And it is this that make them so very important for historians working on the medieval period. So on the basis of these inscriptions, we understand the various aspects of the history of the time. To start with, the boundary of the region, the boundary of the dynasty, the boundary of the whole Sultanate period. So the finest spot of inscriptions and the names of mints inscribed on the coins help in tracing the gradual expansion of Muslim rule in Sultanate period. The territory represented by the Indian states of Haryana and Punjab up till Lahore was under Qutbuddin Aibak sway. An inscription dated 1210 belonged to the last year of his rule was found at Palwal near Hisar. The Iqta of Badaयूं was seemingly well in command under the able governor Iltutmish, as a long inscription over the Mihrab of Idgah refers. So meaning by during the time of Qutbuddin Aibak, the eastern boundary was Badaयूं. The surviving epigraphs cover major parts of Sultan Iltutmish's reigns, beginning 1 year after his accession, as reflected in Palwal inscriptions dated 1211, and continued down to the time of his death in 1235. These epigraphs suggest the stretch of his history or his territory in the west up to Hansi, in the southwest as Ajmer and Nagar, in the south up to Gwalior, in the east up to Bihar Sharif, and in the extreme east up to Gaur, all on the basis of inscriptions, not the textual text. We find few Arabic and Persian inscriptions of Nasiruddin Mahmud at Delhi and its satellite towns Hansi, Meerut, Badaयूं, and Kol. The Aligarh or Kol inscriptions refers to Qutlugh Khan Balban as the governor by whose order a minaret was erected there, thus indicating that by this time in a large part of the Gangetic plains, the Sultan's rule was firmly established. Here we find a 2-minute time to shed light upon these Balban's inscriptions, which find from the debris of the minarets and was collected by our founder, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who put it in the SS Hall, Sir Syed Hall. But during the chairmanship of Professor Ali Nadim Rizvi, he transferred these inscriptions from Sir Syed Hall and put it in the Musa Dakri Museum in a very good mirror-shaped place. So now, these Balban's inscriptions, which found in Aligarh, was the property of Aligarh Muslim University and preserved in the Musa Dakri Museum. Parts of Rajasthan. So again, coming to the boundary, Parts of Rajasthan came under Muslim rule almost right from its inception. Nagaur had been in continued occupation of the Muslim rule right from Mamluk period down to the Mughals. Next comes Bari in Bharatpur district. This town seems to have been the home of Lodi nobility. Then Gujarat was under continuous Muslim rule since its conquest by Alauddin Khalji in 1298. Significantly, in Gujarat, the inscriptions are not only found in the coastal towns such as Cambay, Kambat, Somnath, Prabhas Patan, and also in the interior cities like Patan, Naharwal, and Junagadh. Along with the inscriptions of the Khalji period, we find a large number of inscriptions of the Tughlaq period from Gujarat. And among the Tughlaqs, the large number was in favor of the Firoz Shah Tughlaq. In Maharashtra, especially in the Marathwad region, the inscriptions indicate Muslim rule from the Tughlaq period. Likewise, the region of Malwa became the part of the Sultanate in the 14th century. And Lodis under Sikandar Shah put an end to the Malwa Sultanate because it was ruled by the Khaljis of the Malwa Sultans. By 1306-7, Alauddin Khalji turned his attention toward the south. It was for the first time that the Delhi Sultans ventured in the deep south and dispatched his able commander Malik Naib Kafur to sack Devgiri in the south. In 1310, Malik Kafur captured Warangal in Karnataka of Kakatiya ruler, and in 1311 approached the Hoysal capital Dwar Samudra. A bilingual inscription at Bijapur, dated 1320, records the erection of a mosque by the governor of Deccan, Malik Kamaluddin, or Karimuddin, in the reign of Mubarak Shah Khalji. So by the time of the end of the Khalji rule, the Delhi Sultan, the army of the Delhi Sultanate penetrated into the Deccan proper. Towards the east, the Khalji Empire did not extend beyond the present-day United Provinces. A Persian inscription of Mubarak Shah Khalji's reign found at Bhuili, Mirzapur, might help demarcate the easternmost boundary of the Khalji dynasty. It further indicates the domination of the Bengal ruler Kakaus. The Kakaus belonged to the Balbans side. They were the scion of the Balbans, and they established their rule in Bengal independently by the time of the Khalji, when Khalji came to the throne of Delhi. Kakaus over territory of Bihar by 1290. So then Bihar became the easternmost boundary of Tughlaqs. Later, it emerged as the stronghold of the Sharqis of Janpur. Here we find sometime that Bihar is a very prominent boundary. It took a very prominent place in the time of the Sultanate. Earlier, the town Bihar Sharif is known as Udantapuri, as Al-Biruni suggests. But Minhaj Siraj in his Tabaqat-e-Nasri, on the basis of the viharas, the Buddhist monasteries, called the town as Bihar. And then he himself, during the time of Nasiruddin Mahmud, called this Bihar as Vilayat-e-Bihar. But in inscriptions, we come across the term Bihar as a provincial territory in 14th century Muhammad bin Tughlaq's inscriptions, where we find Ibrahim Malik Beo as the Mukta of Bihar. So now Bihar became the full-fledged territorial unit. Again, it was in between the Sultanate ruler or the Sharqi rulers of Jaunpur and the Bengal rulers of Lucknow. So it was fluctuating territorial boundary. Sometimes it was under the command of the Bengal rulers and sometimes under the Lodis or the Sharqis. So finally, Bahlol Lodi annexed Bihar after defeating the last Sharqi ruler, Hussain Shah, in 1495-96, as an inscription of Bihar Sharif suggests. So after this territorial boundary or dispute of the boundary, the inscription sometimes solved the succession crisis or date of the successions. Again, it is very important that epigraphs supply missing links in the chronology or succession lists of the rulers as well as the governors. For example, Ghiyasuddin Balban ascended the throne in 1266 and ruled up to 1287. Barni, in his Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, mistakenly dates Balban accession in 1263. This literary reference has been refuted by the legend on the extant coins of the period. The latest coin of Nasiruddin Mahmud is dated 1265, to whom Balban succeeded, while Balban's coins commence only from 1266, meaning by the date given by Barni was erroneous. And it was confirmed by the dated documented epigraphs of the Balban legend on the Balban coins. Likewise, the names of three successive 14th century Tughlaqid governors of Bihar are known through epigraphs only. We don't have any information in the literary sources, contemporary literary sources directly. Muhammad bin Tughlaq appointed Ibrahim Malik Bayo as governor of Bihar. Inscriptions on his tomb at Bihar Sharif, as well as an inscription on the Jain temple at Rajgir, mention him as Mukta of Bihar, with high-sounded title Saifuddaulah, meaning by he was the military commander. He died in 1353, as his own tomb's inscription suggests, and was succeeded by his son Dawood Khan as Mukta of Bihar. And in turn, he was succeeded by his brother Malik Suleiman during the reign of Sultan Firoz Shah. Contemporary historians Barni and Afif are silent. Anonymous Sirat-e-Firoz Shahi, while referring the prevalence of hereditary iqta, mentions Dawood Khan bin Bayo as Mukta of Bihar. The first Indo-Sufi Masnavi Chandain, compiled in 1372 by Maulana Dawood in the reign of Firoz Shah, records the name of governor of Dalmau in Raebareli district, as Malik Mubarak, the son of brave Malik Bayo. So, thus literary accounts authenticate the name of first Tughlaqid Mukta of Bihar, Ibrahim Malik Bayo, as mentioned in the epigraphs. So this is the very important figure, because after a long period, after the period of Sultan Iltutmish, Bihar was recaptured by the Tughlaqid governor, whose name was Ibrahim Malik Bayo, but his name missed in the contemporary main accounts of Tarikh Firoz Shahi by Barni and Afif, but it having support from the 14th century accounts. Then we find dispute. Actually, the format of the Sultanate inscriptions is, we find a long list of the Sultan's title, then the long list of the governor's titles, then the purpose of the putting up the inscriptions, the constructions activity, and the builders, and then the writers and composers of the inscriptions. So here we find the confusion in title. The epigraphs shed valuable light on various aspects of history. The epigraphs frequently mention the title of sultans and governors, and often it rectifies the error of the literary texts. The earliest known inscriptions of Alauddin Khalji was found at court in Fatehpur district in United Pradesh, dated 1296. It records the erection of a mosque within a month of his accession. Particular importance is attached to this epigraph as it furnishes the titles with which Alauddin had ascended the throne. The magnificent Sultan, Alauddin as usual, the ruler of the world and the religion, and the second Alexander, Sikandar Sani, the right arm of the capital, etc. So these title was used by Alauddin Khalji for the first time as the Sikandar Sani. The epigraph leaves no doubt that Alauddin Khalji adopted the title Sikandar Sani as his accession and not after 1299. It thus rectifies an error of Burni, which misled modern writers K.S. Lal, an authority of the Khalji dynasty. Likewise, a solitary reference to the title Salatinus Sharq occurs in Ajmer inscriptions of Sultan Iltutmish. It is in Alauddin Ka Jhopla, so it is undated, the damaged inscription, which apparently draws on the tendency to refer to the caliphate as center of authority for the East. So if the caliphate in the Baghdad, Delhi was in the East. So for the Sultan, the Salatinus Sharq is the valid title. But in the same way, the modern scholars tend to interpret the governor's title, Mulukus Sharq. We find a long range of inscriptions, implying that its holder was given charge of the eastern province of the Sultanate. However, it seems more likely that Mulukus Sharq denotes either rank of the nobles or an office, as the term variously occurs not only in the inscriptions of eastern provinces, but also in those of Rajasthan, Gujarat, and even Karnataka. So those were not the eastern territories. So these inscriptions, in my opinion, these title Mulukus Sharq denote either of the rank, most likely it is of the rank of the governors and or of the office. Then we find a mines of information about the administrative system. I'm not going to detail that. The Mukhtar, the Naib Mukhtar, the Mushrif, the content, the Hajib, the Mutasarrif, the Munshi, the collector of the news, etc., etc. I have two articles on the administrative system of the early Delhi Sultanate and the administrative system of the Tughlaq period purely based on the epigraphs, the known epigraphs. So it is not the time to go in detail of the administrative office, administrative institution of the Delhi Sultanate. But here we find the Sultan household had an elaborate administrative machinery. The Hajib, Chamberlain, acted as an intermediaries between the Sultan and the officials. The title Hujjab-e-Uzzam, dated 1319, probably refers to the chief of the Hajib. But in course of time, during the Tughlaq period, a new term, Hajib-e-Hinduan-e-Mamalik, occurred for the first time in Bihar Sharif inscriptions of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, was used to denote the Chamberlain for the Hindus of the kingdom. This office was created during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, probably to deal with the Hindu officers coming to the court. So, same was the view opined by the Qiyamuddin Ahmad in his corpus of Arabic and Persian inscriptions of Bihar. So I also agree with this. It is important to note that in the Tughlaq administration, the Hindus began to hold the high position, even of the executive rank. On the basis of the epigraph, one can say that it was for the first time during the time of Tughlaq that we find the involvement of the new elements, that is the Indians, in the offices and even the high offices. A Sanskrit inscription of Chunar, dated 1333, records that Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq had appointed Hindu Sai Raj as his wazir. Thus, epigraphical evidences suggested liberal outlook of the sultans. The tolerant outlook of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, although he has been dubbed as orthodox towards his Hindu subjects, is reflected in Sanskrit inscriptions of Thakur Kul Chand, the governor of Gaya in Magad region. The purpose of this epigraph is to record the reconstruction of Sun Temple by Kul Chand. Sultan Firoz Shah Tughlaq has been referred in this inscription as Dhilipati, Lord of Delhi, the ruler of the Western country, Paschatya Sultana, possessing unlimited prowess, Asim Paurush. So this epigraph, along with the creation of the office of Hajibe Hindwan Mamalik, suggests a liberal attitude of Sultan Firoz Shah Tughlaq, although in a limited sense. Then for historical geography, information culled from inscriptions are of great value. We find so many references, but here are only one example I put it. The earliest reference in Persian chronicles to Bangarmao in district Unnao dates back to Sultan Ibrahim Lodi's reign. But the presence of the Arabic cenotaph dated 1302 records the passing away of a certain Al-Mujtahid Al-Alim Al-Fazil, Ali bin Ajam. It thus indirectly suggests that this place was already an important center during Alauddin Khalji's reign, where a person of repute resided. Then we only touch one aspect of the political history of the period. And that aspect for the period of the Sultanate up till the time of Alauddin Khilji was the Mongol menace. It was from very early time, from the time of Sultan Iltutmish. They disturbed the western boundary of the Sultanate. The most disturbing political aspect of the early Sultanate period was the growing Mongol pressure. To prevent the Mongols from entering Delhi, Alauddin Khalji made Hansi a military stronghold. An Arabic inscription at Hansi, dated 1298, mentions Alauddin and a certain officer, Ali bin Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Fazl bin Rabia. Two more epigraphs of Hansi, one undated and another dated 1303, record the erection of a strong fort and a massive gateway facing the capital city of Delhi. Thus, these inscriptions show how Alauddin Khalji tried to fortify, checking the inroads of the Mongols. We don't find any reference in the inscription about his market control system or is the strengthening the army. But here we find the strengthening of the army, the strengthening of the bastions, the military strongholds by Alauddin Khalji just to check the Mongol inroads. However, by 1306, the Mongol advance was almost totally blocked. Subsequent to this, Alauddin's commander on the western frontier, Ghazi Malik, the governor of Dipalpur and Lahore, even encouraged to lead expedition every year against the Mongols. In an Arabic inscription of Multan, he declared that I have encountered the Tatars, Mongols, on 29 occasions and defeated them. Hence, I am called Ghazi Malik. So, if this inscription is to be believed, the one governors confronted with the Mongols in foot of 29 times, meaning by the incursion was very repeated. So after these aspects of Sultanate history, the boundary, the political history, the geographical aspects of the towns and the others, one important aspect of the epigraphs is the women representation in these documents. After the death of Sultan Iltutmish, Ruknuddin Firoz became the Sultan. His only inscription dated 1235 refers to him as Sultan. He also minted coins at Delhi in 1235 and 1236 respectively. Taking advantage of his weak position, the combined forces of the governors marched against him. He led the royal army to oppose them, but his officers revolted and killed him. These army officers backed Razia's rise to the throne in 1236. So it was the first lady who became the ruler of Delhi Sultanate among the men, among the world of the men. Her only inscription found at Baran, Bulandshahr, is undated. In this epigraph, she is referred to as Jalaluddin Waddin, the Sultan. The Sultan, the term is very important, the Sultan, daughter of Sultan. So he proclaimed himself as Sultan, not withstand his other gender. So it is very important. His inscription, the only inscription, is very important because here we find the term Sultan for Razia, who adopted this term. Her name with title Jalaluddin is also included in the Palam Bauli inscription. Her coins minted at Lakhnauti in 1236 and 1237 point to her authority being recognized in Bengal. So after Iltutmish, it was only Razia whose authority was accepted in Bengal's rulers. Otherwise, Lakhnauti was on the hostile front for the sultans of the Delhi, even Balban not curbed. So besides royal ladies, we also find the involvement of noble ladies in constructional and charity works. One veiled noble lady constructed a tomb at Hasi in 1225 in the reign of Sultan Iltutmish. Likewise, here the veiled lady is very important. Veiled lady is important because he was in Parda, but he was doing her work. She was in Parda, but she doing her work, the constructional work. She was constructing charity works. Likewise, the tomb of Ghazi Taman Muhammad Afghan was built by his wife Samru, daughter of Mandu Afghan at Hindwan in Rajasthan, in 1329 in the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The epigraph of Kheda in Gujarat, dated 1331, of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign, records the construction of a stepwell, Bauli, for public use by Kadbanu, wife of Iran Shah and daughter of Sayyid Hussain Alvi Tabatabai. So it is evident that the lady had an Iranian background. The epigraphs of Lodi Sultans represented three ladies of noble background. One, Fatima Khatun, the mother of the distinguished Qutub Khan, ordered to build a Jami mosque and a large well at Hisar in 1465 in the reign of Bahlul Shah. So it was not only the masjid for religious purposes, along with the outside of the masjid, it was a large well for the public utility. In the reign of Sikandar Shah Lodi, Bibi Khunda Rasta, daughter of Farid Khan and wife of Masnad Ali Mubarak Khan, son of Iqbal Khan, had built a mosque and a tomb at Bari in Bharatpur, Rajasthan in 1510, and endowed a village for expenditure on oil, lighting, and free kitchen in the mosque and tomb. Bibi Kunda Arasta died in 1517 as epitaph for her grave at Bari at Bharatpur attests. Likewise, the mosque was constructed by Bibi Fatah Malik, daughter of Malik Machi, at Machiwala in Ludhiana, Punjab, in 1517, in the last year of Sikandar Lodi's reign. Apart from these ladies who were involved in the charity works or the constructions of tomb and mosque, religious edifices, we also find a number of ladies' names in the epitaph at Bari in Bharatpur regions. And importantly, all these ladies, except these, the Kunda Arasta, who belong to the Lodi period, all other 4 or 5 ladies belong to the Sayyid period. So even in the literature, we find that by the time of the Sayyid or the Lodis or the Sharqis, the involvement of ladies increased. It was more and more in comparison to that of the earlier time, except that of the Sultan Razia in Iltutmish. After the death of Iltutmish, no reference of the prominent lady came to the fore. So it was the Tughlaq, last year of the Tughlaq, and it was the Lodi and Sayyid period, which involved the ladies in the charity works, in the religious works, and the other works. So, barring Razia, the names of other noble ladies have not been mentioned in literary accounts, although we find the name, do mention the find of the name of the other ladies in these 3 dynasties. So, initially, these epigraphs mentions construction of religious edifices such as mosques, idgah, and tombs, etc. Among the military buildings, forts, bastions, and gateways stand. Among secular buildings, stepwells, wells, and gardens emphasize much on the community works of public utility, among which water supply occupies the foremost place. And it is more important in the case when we find the Bauli and the wells in the Rajasthan regions. So where is the importance of water? So most of the monuments, apart from the religious edifices, the mosques and the idgah and the mausoleum, we find the well and step wells in large number. One inscription of Sayyid ruler Mubarak Shah at Bari in Rajasthan refers the construction of a painted, decorated, round dome, meaning by the domed step well, the step well covered with the roof of the dome. So it was for the first time that we find the reference of domed step well during the time of the Sayyid ruler Mubarak Shah at Rajasthan again, for the comfort of the general public. So apart from these, sometimes we also find, I'm going to close. Nadim, I have time, 2 or 4 minutes. But just I'm concluding. So we find the population and depopulations of the town.
Jabir Saab, you have at least 20 minutes more, so you can go ahead.
but we have I cut it short very vastly, so now it is. So we find two instances. One is the transfer of capital by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. It depopulated the Delhi town itself. The contemporary and the later writers, modern writers, all says that whole Delhi was deserted, and no one except that of the Khanqa of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia. There was no sign of livelihood. But Satish Chandra, on the basis of two stepwell or two well inscriptions, argues that it was not, the exodus was not total. Because he argues that we find these two inscriptions related with the stepwells in the environs of Delhi, meaning by the peoples were very much there, number one, in the environs. And number two, he argues that the coins were minted by that time in Delhi, meaning by the mint house was also alive. And the second instance of the population, depopulation and then populated of the population of the town, we find an inscriptions of the last Tughlaq rulers at Bayana. It was on account of the Taimur's invasion. When Taimur invaded Delhi in 1398, we find these inscriptions in Bayana dated 1401 that on account of the arrival of the Taimur's army, maybe it was a rumor, because we don't have any reference of the touching down the Bayana by the Taimur's army, but Taimur's army ventured after captured the Delhi in the Gangetic region. So the peoples were panicked in Bayana area, and they left the forts or the residing area, the towns, and migrated to Thangal fort just to protect themselves from the arrival of Taimur's army. And when these situations gone out, the peoples again migrated from Thangal fort to reside in the township area. So these inscriptions is very, very important. Like that, we also find one inscriptions about the remission of taxes during the time of Firoz Shah Tughlaq in Gujarat. It is said that the governor of Gujarat, when reached Petlad, he issued an order that no taxes would be collected from the Hindus on the occasion of the marriage. So it is very important aspects of the Tughlaqi period, remission of taxes. Now, I worried that I have much information, so I cut it short. So now I conclude. And in conclusion, in the end, I would like to discuss Mannan Ahmad's recent book, a very recent book. In his book, Mannan Ahmad, The Loss of Hindustan and the Invasion of India. He titled his book as The Loss of Hindustan and the Invention of India. In his work, Mannan Ahmad has drawn attention to the influence of colonial historiography in shaping our understanding of the medieval period. In this historiography, he argues the inclusive idea of Hindustan has been replaced with an exclusive and antagonistic idea of India. It is very important. He argues that in the historiography, in the colonial historiography, the inclusive idea of Hindustan has been replaced with an exclusive and antagonistic idea of India. So it was Hindustan versus India. We lost India. We lost Hindustan in achievement of India. So in recovering the history of Hindustan as against India, inscriptions are a valuable source in at least two respects. They help us recover inclusive social spaces in the history of the period. Secondly, unlike the colonial historiography, these valuable sources convey a picture of the state that was receptive to the concerns of the subjects. A very good example of the remission of taxes by the governors himself. So meaning by he was in conjunction with the view of the sultans, and that is why he did so to the concerns of the subjects, and was far removed from the oriental despot underneath in colonial historiography. So thank you, Nadeem. This is the end. Anna? I cut short because I was worried that I have much information, but so I cut short it.
Professor Jabir Raza, it was really very refreshing to hear what kind of informations we get from the epigraph, from the various inscriptions. Thank you that you remain confined to the Sultanate period, the early period. Otherwise, it would really have become quite unmanageable for anybody
Yes.
understand the value of the epigraphs as far as history writing is concerned. I must also thank you before we start with the question answer session that you brought in the work of Mannan Ahmad, which is a recent publication. Thank you very much for, in fact, referring to that work. And to our viewers, let me inform that Mannan himself would be with us within a few weeks to discuss various aspects of the period on which he specializes.
So nice of you.
And now that you, Professor Jabir, you have pointed out this quotation, so I will actually ask him to elaborate on this particular thing.
This point, yes.
Point as well. Let us now start with the question answer session, and I think the first question is by Mirza Hasnain. Sir, I remember listening to your informative talk on Ghaznavid Empire. Thank you, Mirza Hasnain. You remember something which happened 6 months back. I want to ask that is this: is it true that Durud-e-Lakhi was written by Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi? And from which sources we can learn about the life of Malik Ayaz and what were his contributions to Lahore as its governor?
Yes, Ms. Haidar, thank you. So there are two questions. One is about the Durud-e-Lakhi. We don't find any reference of these, either in the inscriptions or in the contemporary works. We find only one inscription of Mahmud Ghaznavi in Persian at in Punjab, and it was in the well. And the another inscriptions of his period was found by Z.A. Desai from Baroda. So it was these inscriptions informs about the detached army commanders from the Somnath expeditions towards the Baroda. And to confirm that this inscription is true, Z.A. Desai supported with the local manuscripts of the local dialect that. And the man was known as the nephew of Sultan Mahmud, as usual, because we find that this type of informations regarding the Ghazi Masood of Bahraich also. Although he was not a nephew, he was only the Ghazis of his period. The second question is very large, Malik Ayaz. I have one article on this. So it was mostly Malik Ayaz has been referred in the literature. It was Gardezi in his Zainul Akhbar who started writing about him. But earlier, we find his reference more in Diwan-e Farrukhi and Chahar Maqala. And then the Farid Attar's work, poems, and even Sheikh Sadi, and more in Jalaluddin Rumi's Masnavi. So on the basis of these and all other literatures, I have traced the life of Ayaz right from the time of as a Nadim to slave to Sultan Mahmud, then commander during the time of Sultan Masood, then the governor of Punjab during the time of Sultan Maudud, and then also as a man of Sufi nature. We also find his reference in the Jawamiul Hikayat wal Awamil Rifayat of Afiq. Here we find two anecdotes related with Ayaz. One was that Sultan Mahmud wanted to marry his sister and he was in dilemma, but his wazir consoled him and cleared the way. And secondly, once he was in a hunting in forest and people cried out that Homa is coming, Homa, a bird. And it is said that it is a mythological bird. And when this bird crossed the head or shed the shadow of her on the man became the ruler. So Ayaz was all the people's, all the army men of Sultan Mahmud deserted him, except that of Ayaz. And when Sultan Mahmud asked him, why you don't go? His reply was, you are my Homa. So I am in the shadow of the Homa. So I don't need to go anywhere. So like this, and his humble origin was reflected in the Sheikh Sadi's anecdotes that he belonged to very poor family and he used to wear his old clothes and chappals in the night, and the people who were having enmity with him informed the Sultan that in the night he went out in the chambers and did something. He had amassed a large wealth. The Sultan ordered to search this his hujra, and found that a very tutti-frutti, a broken box was there. And in that box, a very old cloth was there with a sandal. And after asking, the Ayaz reply to Sultan Mahmud was, it is the original. It is my origin. So I don't want to forget my bad days, although I am living in your company and enjoying all the things. So
Well, the second question is by Mr. Ali Haider. No, by Ali Haider. This is the question. Yeah. Sir, amazing coin minted in the name of Sultan Alauddin Khilji was found in Nepal. So is it possible that Nepalese rulers were also the tributary of Khalji Empire? Number one.
Mm.
And did all dynasties of Delhi Sultanate from Mamluk to Lodis used to inscribe the name of Abbasid caliphs on their coins?
So the first question, it is very hard to believe that the Nepalis were having their vassalage of the Khalji. Because in territorial boundary, we find that the Khalji Empire had not crossed the Mirzapur region. So when he didn't enter in the Bihar or the Tirhut region, it was the Tirhut, which was close to Nepal. It was the Vaishali region, which was close to Nepal. So when he crossed, either he was entered in the Tirhut region, or if he had led an expeditions to Bengal through this route from Jaunpur to Tirhut to Lucknowti, then it might be possible. But since he had not crossed the Mirzapur region and he had concentrated all his attentions in the Gujarat and the southern region, in the Devgiri, in the Bijapur, and in the Warangal area, and even in the Maratha areas. So it is hard to believe that Nepal was in any way having their overlordship, the Sultan Alauddin Khalji having their overlordship over the king or over the chieftains of Nepal. Secondly, the name of the Abbasid caliphs, it is not frequently, it is not frequently, and not even the Alauddin Khalji's coins. So it was the earlier rulers used to inscribe this, but later on it was diminished. Sometimes we find, sometimes not. But the Alauddin Khalji's uh, coins, I think it was not mentions of any name of the Abbasid Caliphate. We do find the name of Abbasid Caliphate in the Ghaznavid coins, in the Ghorid coins, in the Iltutmish coins, but not later.
Professor Jabir Raza is quite right to say that as far as the invocation of the Khalifa is concerned, we seldom have any invocation during the late Sultanate period. In fact, after the coming of the Khaljis to power,
Hmm.
uh, maybe there is no mention of any of the Khalifa at all. Uh, mm, Possibly confined only till Iltutmish's period. Secondly, as far as your first question was concerned, it is not necessary, Ali Heather, that if a coin or something is found in a region, it is not necessary that one had a political control over it. The coin may have been taken there by some merchant or somebody who was traveling to that area. So, as Professor Jabir Raza pointed out, Nepal had never been a part of the Indian rule prior to the coming of the colonial period. Possibly never at all. So that is out of question. The next question to you is by Sayyid Ali Kazim. Yes. Do we have inscriptions during this period being put up by the Mongols as they have made a deep inroads into India under the leadership of important generals who owed allegiance to Tarma Shirin Batu and Dawa Khan? In the case of the presence, those inscriptions we can construct a balanced account, which they had left
No,
behind.
sorry, Sayyid Kazim. We don't find any inscriptions or any contemporary accounts left by the Mongols in India or in the Afghanistan or Central Indian Territory. So the only near contemporary account was or is the Minaj Siraj Tabqat Nasri. So we don't find any inscriptions. We do find the reference in Juvenis and other works about the inroad of Mongols but more accurately was the references extended by Minhaj Siraj, because he confronted Mongols in Central Asia as well as India too. So we don't have, and I don't think that the Mongols used to put up the documents, the inscriptions in anywhere, because we don't find in Central Asia also any of his inscriptions in Central Asia.
I would just remind Dr. Ali Kazim that what to talk about the period with which Professor Raza is dealing, and he rightly pointed out in the end part of his statement that even outside the Indian borders, there's hardly any Mongol inscriptions
Inscriptions,
ever
yes.
been found. I remember what Babar had to say about the Mongols. Although he took this association seriously, remembering that he also belonged from his maternal side to, he was related to Mongols in Genghis Khan. He also invokes a number of Mongol theories. In spite of that, his actual feeling towards Mongols were that they are illiterate, uncouth people. So till the very end, please don't expect Mongols to have left anything which has to do with academics. Hussain Aziz, there's a question by Hussain Aziz. Uh, the question by Hussain Aziz is, Sir, did Sayyid dynasty used to mint coins in the name of Amir Temur? If yes, then can we call Sayyid dynasty as the precursor Timurid Empire of India of the Mughal Empire, as they were acting as the vassal of Timurids? And does not minting of various states of India like Marathas, Mysore, Bhopal, etc., in the name of Shah Alam II suggest that nominally Mughal Empire never disintegrated and all its successor states were just acting in its name as de jure Emperor of India till 1858? Two separate questions, sir.
But the second half is not concerned with me. The first half, we do find very little number of Sayyid coins, very little number of the Sayyid coins. And as far as my knowledge goes, maybe I'm mistaken, but we don't find the name of Amir Temur. Don't find the name of Amir Temur. So it was, the Sayyids were very much connected with the Sharqis, not the Temurs. And after Sayyid, it was the Lodhis. So we find a long time. So maybe as we find that the inscriptions of the last Siena of the Tughlaqid period, in that inscriptions even, we only having the passing reference of the Taimur's incursion or Taimur's invasions, not in detail, not having any title, using the title of Amir Taimur like that of the Sahib Qara, a very important title of Amir Taimur. But we don't find in this Bayana or in this Isar Tahangarh inscriptions. So when the last Tughlaqid rulers didn't have the name of Temur, then why these Sayyid rulers? I'm not sure, but I don't find any reference of Temurs on the Sayyid coins. Second half, I'm not
Okay,
sure.
I will. So, Hassan Aziz, have been both beautiful questions. I will first continue from what Professor Jabir Raza has said as far as your first question is concerned. Whether Amir Temur is ever invoked, coins or otherwise, by the Sayyid or Lodi dynasty, it never was. Uh, Possibly that is what the information collected by all historians is that they had nothing to do. And your question has well been answered by Babar himself when he writes a letter to Lodis, the Lodi dynasty, to the king whom he was coming to conquer. One of the pretexts of entering India and conquering India is that you don't have the right to rule here. It belongs to my grandfather. I am the successor of Timur. And because there was a time when Timur had conquered India, I have the right and the territory belongs to me. The Timurids of Central Asia, one of the Timurid princes of Central Asia was Babur. There were many others. And one of them, Babur, extended his claim to India because the Indian territory had once been a part of his grandfather's empire. As far as so, it makes very clear that the dynasty or dynasties which he was now replacing had nothing to do with the Timurids at all. I mean, Timur came, he carried down destructions, and in India, whatever memories remained were of a very ferocious person who had attacked the Indian territory. The image of Timur once again became that of a good, holy man only after the coming of the establishment of the Mughal dynasty. So I think that is enough as far as your first question is concerned. As far as the latter question is concerned, it is a very interesting question. I think all of us who are listening to this program should remain aware that there was a time till 1857-58 that every other state who otherwise were zor talab, were otherwise never paying their taxes, were otherwise taking up positions of authority, in fact claiming themselves as near sovereigns, just like Awadh or Mysore or the rulers, Nawabs of Bhopal, or for example, of any other territory which existed during that period. Why do you forget Rani of Jhansi or Tatia Tope or any of these Maratha kingdoms? All of them were paying lip service in spite of their independence, claims of independence to the Mughal ruler. The fact that they issued coins in the name of the Mughal ruler did tell that just like during the period of Iltutmish, when Iltutmish had established an independent sultanate in the country, but to be on a safer side, he was paying lip service to the Khalifa in the similar fashion during the 19th century till the 19th century. All these states, although acting semi-independent, but were paying lip service to the Mughal ruler. Remember that Tatia Tope and Rani Jhansi, when they revolted for their own personal reasons, we can argue that they didn't have those imaginations of a Indian state proper. No, they were Rani Jhansi was fighting for her own rights. Tatia Tope was fighting for his own rights. But all of them, when they revolted, whom did they choose as the icon? They chose Bahadur Shah Zafar, and it was under the flag of Zafar that they fought, and they called themselves as Mujahids. So, meaning thereby, and that is why we historians, at least of the Aligarh school, keep on reiterating the fact that is what even Sir Sayyid did, and that is that the demise of the Mughal Empire did not take place in 1756 or 7 or whatever date of Plassey or whatever. The empire as such, not the political authority, but the concept of the empire was actually finished off only in 1858 when the British Crown took up the position. Sorry for the long, interjection in between. Is there any other question? Yes, Tarun Mathur. Ghaznavi took away many people from India to Afghanistan. Can the Indian descendants be identified as of today?
Indian descendant in Afghanistan, it is very hard. Also, we find that right from the time of Sultan Mahmud till the end, it was the migration of India Indian Sipasalar or Indian commander or Indian people or Indian soldiers to Afghanistan. But Mathur Sahib, it is very hard to say that any Indian commanders who migrated from Kashmir or Bayana or the Punjab regions or the Gangetic regions in the time of the Sultan Mahmud and Masood, especially having their son or having their family in that region. Although we do find that Tilak was living in the uh, Afghanistan region for a long period, but we don't find any information about his family. So it is all about all the sources talking about the Sipasalar, the Salar, the army men, the Mahawat, the elephant riders who were living not only in Afghanistan, but in the Central Asia, deep in the Central Asia, in the Samarkand and the Khwarizm and Bukhara regions. But the family tree, it is very difficult to find in anywhere in that period. Even in the medieval Sultanate period, we don't find the family tree. By the time of the Mughals, we find the family tree in the inscriptions, in the fashions of the Sanskrit inscriptions, where we find the composers of the family tree of the composers, family tree of the writers. So we don't have the family tree in Sultanate period. So how we expect the family tree of the Ghaznavid periods in the Central Asian part? So we don't have. We don't have, Matiji. Sorry, you have consulted me earlier, but I have no clue to give you.
Tarunji, I'll just also point out that we have references in the Ghaznavite sources cited by Muhammad Habib that these Indians who migrated to or were taken to Ghazni settled there, and they also had their own habitations and constructed their own buildings and temples. But I don't know whether the remains of even those buildings exist today. So that is a question which needs to be looked into. Don't take the answer of Professor Jabir Raza as an affirmative no. That is a good topic to research. Now, coming to another question by one of our students at Aligarh, Damini Yadav. Sir, do we find any inscription related to the reign of Prithviraj Chauhan?
We do find the name of Chauhan inscribed on the Qutub Minar. And in another inscriptions of Shahabuddin Ghori, we also find the reference of Prithviraj Chauhan, but in a very passing reference, in a very passing way, not in detail. That on the basis of that we can frame any history of the Prithviraj Chauhan. But we do find numerous places in numerous times, various times. On Qutub Minar, we find 2 or 3 inscriptions just Prithviraj Chauhan in Hindi, in Nagari.
But I don't think that any epigraph of Prithviraj as the ruler ever exists.
No.
Probably no. But
No.
yes, in non-Persian and non-Arabic traditions, there are a number of Chahamala, inscriptions. Chahamalas are the same as the Chauhans. But Prithviraj or Delhi was a very small principality as far as the Chahamalas were concerned. Possibly none exists. So let us take the some other question. Sayyid Ali Kazim. Muhammad bin Tughlaq got a fatwa issued from one of the descendants of Abbasids based in Cairo in order to prove his legitimacy while suppressing revolts against his rule.
But sorry, Kazim, because I don't consult the documents of the Muhammad bin Tughlaq times. So it might be in
Tactically हम
existence.
बहुत से काम कर लेते हैं. That doesn't mean that you actually believe in this
हाँ.
bullshit. Another question. What is the contribution of Iltutmish?
Oh, it is very, very good questions. So actually, Iltutmish has been dubbed or called as the real founder of the Delhi Sultanate. Why he was called the real founder? The actual founder was the Qutbuddin Aibak, but real founder because Aibak was ruled from Lahore. He was living in Lahore. He died in Lahore while he was playing Chaugan. So after his death, his son Aram Shah came to the throne for the short period. And then when Iltutmish became the ruler, he actually established the administrative system of the Delhi Sultanate. He actually established the capital at Delhi. He introduced the Iqta system to govern the Gangetic Principality in a small town. He actually introduced the new coins, the Jital. Otherwise, earlier, as we find the reference in the Qutub Minar, it was the Delhi Wal. So it was all the things either of the establishment of the capital of Delhi, making Haji Khas and the other things, and it or the establishment of the administrative system right from the time of his governorship. He worked for that because when he was governor of Badaयूं, the whole region of Badaयूं was under his strong control. So when he became the ruler of Delhi, he started doing all the things which a new dynasty demanded. So since he did all the things, he established the Delhi Sultanate. So that is why he was termed as the real founder of the Delhi Sultanate, from the coin systems up to the administrative unit and the governor system and the expeditions led by him in the Rajasthan area up to Ajmer and Nagar, and in the eastern area up to Bengal and Bihar. So it was the expansionist policy of Sultan Iltutmish, which was not defined during the time of Qutbuddin Aibak. So he was the first ruler who led long expeditions as well as who minted coins and who divided the territorial unit into various provincial units to cater the administrative system.
Well, I think there are two other questions, both by Mahfouz Priye. One of them has been put there. Sir, there are many inscriptions bilingual we find during the reign of Sikandar Lodi. Please throw some light on them.
Yes, because by the time of Sikandar Lodi, we find the influx of Indian nobility. So it was but obvious that we find much of the bilingual coins during the time of Lodi, or either in earlier period, we do find the bilingual coins of the Balban, of the Iltutmish, or the Tughlaqs, but in Lodi period, it was frequent. And most of the bilingual inscriptions are not documented in the Epigraphia Indica of Arabic Persian supplement, but it was on the archaeological report of the Indian epigraphy. So here we find some confusion in finding the real terms of the Sanskrit language or the actual terms of the Arabic language. But we do find a number of bilingual.
Right. The second question of Priya is, my second question is whether any inscription or epigraph under the name of Tughlaq ruler after the sack of Delhi by Temur.
Yes, yes. I have mentioned just now the Biana, the Tahargar inscriptions. And in Biana, we also find the second and third inscriptions. And the other places, but he was the last ruler. Since he was the last ruler, so we do find the very few inscriptions of the Tughlaqid period after the sack of Delhi by Timur in 1398. But after in 1398, he sacked Delhi, but we find the inscription in Bayana in 1400 and 1401.
Bilal Malik, it's a very interesting but general question which you have asked. Why is Muhammad bin Tughlaq called the Mad King? Though he was so learned, yes, I mean, it's almost every time that those who are learned are always known as madmen.
Mad.
Actually, that this whole legend of Muhammad bin Tughlaq being, Majmu-e Ajdad, a pack of contradictions, was circulated or came into existence by the predicaments faced by Zia Barni himself. The person who was writing the Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi, he was writing it at a time when he had been punished, sent to prison during the reign of Feroz Shah Tughlaq by those who had been promoted and given positions of authority during the period of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So whenever Zia Barni was, reminiscing his old time, he would be praising Muhammad bin Tughlaq for whatever honors he got, and whenever he realized the present situation in which he was, he would then curse the king and say that he did this and he did that, so much so that when we, without realizing what Zia Barni was going through, read his account, we find Muhammad bin Tughlaq as a sultan who was full of contradictions, number one. Number two, the policies which he undertook during his period were such that some of them were not understood by the people of his age. And thirdly, it is the colonial historians who got the pretext of labeling him as a madman, just like the present day Modi historians try to present Alauddin as a savage and nothing else. So, that has nothing to do with the topic epigraphs. Professor Jabir Raza, I think thanks a lot for a very good discussion as well as a lecture. Shaykh Ilyas has also a question which again needs much elaboration. What type of information is provided for religious acculturation during Sultanate and Mughal periods? So, in fact, on behalf of Professor Jabir Raza, I would just answer that we would be requesting Jabir Raza to come once again and deliver a third lecture so that he may give an answer to what Sheikh Ilyas has asked. Let me just finish off with this session with certain of my brief comments, although and my wrong understandings of what I got from your lecture. From your lecture, what I think I derived was that there's hardly any information as far as market control measures is concerned.
Yes, we don't have.
There is no reference, and it is really, really very intriguing that such an important act. I mean, the sultans took pride in elaborating upon their acts. They were always, mentioning them on their, advertising their deeds, just like Modi ji. एक छोटा सा काम भी करते हैं तो बड़े बड़े बैनर के साथ. So that is just the work of the sultans, and they were doing such things. But it is really very interesting to note that no information on market control measures. I would also suggest that when Professor Jabir Raza used the term Hindu, twice he used that term when he said that there was a special office created for the benefit of the Hindus, and then he also gave an example of certain other things. Let me also point out and in fact reiterate what he said, that it is erroneous to claim that non-Muslims started getting recruited only from the period of Akbar onwards. No, not at all. It is from
No,
the
no,
Sultanate
no.
period
Even
onwards.
Wazir was appointed by Muhammad bin
Wazir
Tughlaq.
referred to that term. But my note of caution would be that when we read the term Hindu, at least in the earlier period of the Sultanate sources, we should be very clear in the mind. And the articles of Professor Irfan Habib and others have pointed it out very carefully, that the term Hindu did not stand or was not used for a religious community at all. The term was the term Hindu, in a general sense of the term, was used for the indigenous people.
People,
Now,
yes.
the English equivalent of that today would be non-Muslims, those who were inhabitants of the country. Them they are known as. As far as the period even of Alauddin Khilji is concerned, I think Professor Jabir Raza Saab would support me in this. That when the Zia Barni mentions that Hindu women were asked to work in the houses of the nobles, it is not the Hindu religious community which is meant. What is meant is the intermediary classes, the classes who were involved in the collection of the fiscal taxes, the classes who were in between the peasant and the state, the classes who were getting enriched and ultimately in a position to revolt. It was the emergence of a new class, which ultimately, by the time that Mughals came to power, came to be known as Rajputs. So it was a particular class which is being referred to. So my only caution is that the term Hindu, when used in the Sultanate sources, has to be qualified that the term does not stand for the entire community as we know it today. Uh, uh, Professor Raza, there is another issue which I wanted to highlight. I don't know whether the epigraphs of the Sultanate period, and I know that much work has been done on that, and there are many people who worked on the epigraphic material, starting with Ziauddin Desai and Shakib Saab, who recently died, and there are many, many more, both in India and in Pakistan. Were these epigraphs of the Sultanate period? In fact, all of this started with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan himself, who started collecting the epigraphs on the buildings at Delhi, started noting them down, even those which were non-Persian. He tried to note them down. But what I was wondering is whether these epigraphs, this whole quantum of material which has been brought out in Epigraphia Indica and ASI reports and so on and so forth, has it ever been tabulated and quantified as to which reign, how many epigraphs? Then it would be much more easier for us to understand a number of historical developments which you were talking about. I mean, many aspects which you took up would be elaborated further if we have a study which is much more, studied in a more, structured way. Uh, and secondly, we would also take into account that how many of these, I mean, this quantification would tell us how many inscriptions survive from which period. Hmm. Tughlaq में इतने हुए, खलजी में इतने हुए, फला में इतने हुए, एंड देन व्हाट टाइप ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन, कितों में किस टाइप की इंफॉर्मेशन है, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव कितों पे है, रिलीजियस कितों पे है, कितने सिर्फ रिलीजियस उसके ऊपर लिखे गए हैं, कितने कहाँ पे लिखे गए हैं. I think that is one of the jobs which still remains to be done. If has been done, I am not aware of that, and I think a proper perspective of what information, historical information is contained there would only be revealed if we study it like that. Uh, Secondly, there's another issue which hopefully we would, if time permits, and we have some other lecture on the same topic, we can deal it with there. We know that there are three, type of. Samira Sheikh also pointed that out. You have also referred to that. That there are many multilingual, epigraphs. Sometimes epigraph there are multilingual inscriptions. Sometimes there are individual inscriptions which are in Sanskrit or in some other indigenous language. There are inscriptions which are either in Persian or in Arabic or containing both Persian and Arabic. One way of looking at the historical information in epigraphs is that we should also pay attention कि किस टाइप के किस लैंग्वेज के डॉक्यूमेंट्स में कौन सी इंफॉर्मेशन है. क्या पब्लिक वर्क्स जो संस्कृत और इंडिजिनस डॉक्यूमेंट्स हैं उसमें ज्यादा मेंशन की जा रही है सो दैट पब्लिक कैन अंडरस्टैंड, या अरबी वालों में की जा रही है, या फारसी वाले में की जा रही है जहां सिर्फ नोबल मैन पढ़ रहा है. आज भी जो इंग्लिश इज टुडे द लैंग्वेज ऑफ द लिटरेट, बट स्टिल वी नो दैट इन इंडिया टुडे हर प्रोग्राम के बाद हमको ये फीडबैक मिलती है कि प्रोग्राम को हिंदी में कीजिए, अंग्रेजी बहुत कम लोग समझते हैं, है ना. तो उस पीरियड में भी फारसी बहुत पॉपुलर होती जा रही थी. फ्रॉम the Sultanate period up till the Mughal period, that was the language, official language, which prevailed. But how many were there to understand the official language? Most of the people would have understood the indigenous languages. Or, I would also say that Sanskrit too might not have been understood by the public in general. जो बाहर से आए हुए लोग हैं वो तो संस्कृत समझते ही नहीं होंगे. इवन जो इंडिजिनस लोग हैं, एक आध ब्राह्मण को छोड़ के कोई और भी नहीं उसको समझ पाता होगा. तो अगर लैंग्वेज बेस्ड करके किस टाइप की इंफॉर्मेशन कहाँ पे आई हुई है उस वो भी अकाउंट में लेते हुए एपिग्राफ्स पे काम किया जाए, तो आई थिंक कि जो आपका टॉपिक था कि रिकंस्ट्रक्टिंग द पास्ट विद द हेल्प ऑफ एपिग्राफ्स, दैट जॉब वुड बी मेड मच मोर इजी. Anyhow, sir, Professor Jabir Raza, you are and you will remain our Sultanate man. Aligarh now does not have any Mughalist as well, what to talk about Sultanate, but possibly after Bosworth, if I really read any articles of someone who has worked on the original sources of the period, it is your articles after Bosworth which give me information about the Ghaznavides and the early Sultanate period. Keep working. Thanks a lot. I hope that you will join us.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. I hope you would have gained something from this beautiful lecture of today. Khuda Hafiz. Good night.
Khuda Hafiz.